Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Almost exactly a year since Britain voted to leave the European Union, formal negotiations have begun in Brussels. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, has vowed to get a deal like no other in history. His opposite number, representing the European Commission, is Michel Barnier, who wants to address the uncertainties caused by Brexit first. He said this evening the clock is ticking. Our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus reports.
This is history being made and unmade.
Ready to make history, Mr. Davis?
David Davis's mission in Brussels to unstitch a relationship 44 years old. It's almost exactly a year since the referendum, and David Davis says with these talks he's going to end up with a deal like no other before it. The EU side are simply waiting to see what it is he wants. But the UK has yet to decide, and Article 50 has been triggered, so negotiations have to begin between Mr. Davis and his opposite number, Michel Barnier. This day was about setting the tone. Already they decided talks will happen in English and French 1 week a month. They swapped gifts on a mountaineering theme. Many believe in front of them is a mountain to climb. The first item on the talks agenda will be how to secure citizens' rights in future for EU citizens in the UK, UK citizens in the EU, how to calculate the UK's financial obligations to the EU, and how to avoid new border controls between the UK and Ireland. Ireland's going to be one of the hardest issues of all, and this afternoon Theresa May was meeting with Ireland's new Prime Minister.
It will remain our priority to work closely with the Irish Government to ensure a frictionless and seamless border as possible.
In Brussels, the negotiators emerged this evening to say they'd made much progress.
Both of us want to achieve the best possible outcome and the strongest possible partnership, one that works for the UK and for the EU.
So Mr. Davis has conceded a major point. He'll follow the EU's plan for phased talks.
In the first step, we will deal with the most pressing issues. We must lift the uncertainty caused by Brexit. We want to make sure that the withdrawal of UK happens in an orderly manner.
That means the UK must satisfy the EU's initial demands before talks about a future relationship can happen, possibly in the autumn. David Grammaticus, BBC News, Brussels.
And our Europe editor, Katja Adler, joins me now. So day one of many, Katja. Any surprises?
Well, George, you could say if you were a cynic, you could say it is quite surprising that in the 12 months since the referendum in the UK to leave the EU, all that mudslinging that you've had on both sides, that the two chief negotiators from both sides today burst out of their first day of talks and say this was very positive, this was very constructive. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, saying a fair deal for both sides is perfectly possible, and David Davis saying that he is a determined optimist. However, he had wanted to talk about trade right from the off in parallel with all the divorce details, and as we heard there from Damien, it appears that the EU has got its way. That has got to come later. What he did insist, though, David Davis, is that Brexit means Brexit in those terms. It means a hard Brexit, in his opinion, as described by some, out of the single market and out of the customs union as well. What both men agreed on today is that these will be transparent negotiations, informing parliaments across the EU, of course in the United Kingdom, informing the public as well. But of course, the British public and the EU negotiators here are waiting to hear any details on the British negotiation to date.
Katja, thank you very much.
Today, the Prime Minister visited Muslim leaders to reassure them after last night's terror attack. It is yet another tough test for Mrs May, and it comes just as crucial Brexit talks begin in Brussels. There too, thoughts were of healing divisions, as our political correspondent Paul Brand reports.
They are walking towards divorce, but look closely and this is more like makeup than breakup. The handshake was long, and so were the talks. But the first round of Brexit negotiations left both sides feeling friendly.
Today marks the start of a journey for the United Kingdom and for the European Union. There's a long way to go, but we're off to a promising start.
A fair deal is possible and far better than no deal. That is why we will work all the time with the UK and never against the UK.
David Davis and Michel Barnier may be the public faces, but behind the scenes, the EU's key figure is Sabine Weyand, who's been negotiating trade deals for 20 years. Today she faced the UK's Oliver Robbins, the Brexit department's top civil servant. They agreed the first issues will be the rights of EU citizens in the UK and vice versa. The divorce bill Britain will have to pay when we leave, and the Northern Irish border. That was also up for discussion as the Prime Minister met her new Irish counterpart today. In reality, much of Brexit will be done leader to leader. As Labour question whether we have the right one.
We're in the worst of all starting positions. Nobody's clear what the mandate is for the Prime Minister's position any longer. And she's lost authority abroad. And so she needs to reset, and she needs to reset pretty quickly.
But already both sides have exchanged something. David Davis given a walking stick, Michel Barnier a book on mountaineering. Both love to walk. Now they're just missing a map to navigate their most challenging journey. Paul Brandt, ITV News.
Well, our Europe editor James Mates is in Brussels. So James, has the UK then caved into the EU over the way these talks are actually going to be conducted?
Well, pretty much, yes. One of the reasons they talked about progress today is that London has agreed to do it exactly as the rest of the EU said it was going to happen, right up until the weekend. London had insisted, we want to talk about our eventual trade relationship, a trade deal, alongside the divorce issues of citizens' rights and the Brexit bill. Well, it turns out we're going to do it exactly as Europe wanted to. First, those tricky issues, and only when enough progress has been made on that. In other words, only after we've effectively agreed to the Brexit bill will they talk about our future trade relationship, which does, it seems, illustrate just how weak the UK's negotiating position is going to be in these talks, because the clock is ticking and it's ticking against us, and there's really not going to be very much leverage. Michel Barnier was asked, could you name one concession that you have made to the British in these talks today? And he simply looked and said, well, it was them who asked to leave.
All right, James Mates in Brussels, thank you.
Now, the two men leading the Brexit negotiations have exchanged gifts and say they've made an encouraging start on the business of extricating Britain from the European Union. The Brexit Secretary David Davis and the EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier held a full day of talks in Brussels, focusing first on the issues of the rights of expatriates, the financial settlement for Britain's departure and other separation issues, including arrangements at the Irish border. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports from Brussels.
Just ahead of the anniversary of the UK's historic vote, Britain's chief negotiator was in Brussels at last to negotiate divorce. David Davis and his opposite number Michel Barnier beginning talks which are supposed to be over just 500 days from now. A tight timetable for Britain's biggest decision in decades, though Mr Davis beamed for the cameras, while Mr Barnier looked rather more sombre at the enormity of the task ahead.
Our objective is clear. We must first tackle the uncertainties caused by Brexit. First for citizens, but also for the beneficiaries of the EU policies and for the impact on borders, in particular Ireland.
We're starting this negotiation in a positive and constructive tone, determined to build a strong and special partnership between ourselves and our European allies and friends for the future. Thank you.
The flags here are at half-mast, marking the death of Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, one of the architects of the European project. While over lunch on the 13th floor, they were discussing the framework for separation and the timetable for the talks ahead. David Davis's jovial right-hand man, Sir Tim Barrow, the UK's ambassador to the EU. Mr Barnier's right-hand woman, Sabine Weyand, described by a colleague as having the brain power of a nuclear reactor. Perhaps the biggest of many elephants in the room here, whether the UK will foot the bill for leaving. Though one leading German MEP who advises Mr Barnier told me that as of last Friday, not a single British paper on the UK's negotiating position had been received.
Our position is clear. 27 member countries, the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council have agreed in a big understanding, and that is in detail on place. It's known in the public, but I have not seen a piece of paper from the United Kingdom until now.
So as a UKIP MEP, this must be a very happy day for you.
Yeah, finally got there. I'd have liked it to have been 10, 11 months ago. 9 months to write a letter saying we're leaving. You know, I hope we are on our way out. I hope this is the first day of the beginning of the end, and that we'll be shot at this place very soon.
But tonight the bonhomie flowed, with both sides agreeing to meet 1 week every month. Agreed priorities: the rights of British and EU citizens, the status of the Northern Irish border and the Brexit bill. Mr Barnier dismissing the Prime Minister's once swashbuckling talk of a hard Brexit.
A fair deal is possible and far better than no deal. That is what I said to David today. That is why we will work all the time with the UK and never against the UK.
Mr Davis last month spoke of a row brewing over the order of talks, but he seems to have accepted that, though still insisting the UK's future trading relationship will be discussed as well.
They should be agreed alongside each other. This is completely consistent with the Council's guidelines that state nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
So a positive start, nobody dropping a ball, though the Frenchman talked about honouring financial commitments, and the Briton did not talk about that at all. Well, a senior EU official is quoted here as saying tonight that the British side is still querying whether there is any legal basis for paying any EU Brexit bill at all. So that's a huge bone of contention. The other one, I think, is when those talks on the future trading relationship begin. Mr Barnier is talking about concrete progress on Brexit first, and there may be some disagreement about when that concrete progress has actually been made. Mr Barnier gave Mr Davis a walking stick as a present. Mr Davis gave his counterpart a book on mountaineering, and there's a sense that there is a very long trek ahead of us here.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, let's turn now to our political editor, Gary Gibbon, who's in Westminster. Gary, has the government's Brexit policy changed much as far as you can work out?
Well, the sequencing, as Jonathan was just saying, it looks prima facie as if the government has accepted the EU case that there has to be sufficient progress made in the earlier areas for discussion, the Brexit bill and citizens' rights, the primary ones, before you can move on to a future relationship conversation. Now, we'll only know when we look back in years to come whether sufficient progress was a minimalist interpretation or a maximalist interpretation, whether that really was an early victory for the EU over Britain. David Davis did say in his remarks that he'd be talking to other parties. Now that pricked up a few ears, although at the moment it looks a bit as though he's going to be informing them rather than consulting them as this process moves forward. All in all, if you look back to what it seems like the Prime Minister said to the Brexit subcommittee on Wednesday of last week, her position as outlined in the Lancaster House speech that Britain is coming out of the single market, is coming out of the customs union, that, the fundamentals, as it were, of the Brexit deal has not changed. And if you think, and some people do, that the general election was trying to send the government a message to soften its Brexit, well then at the moment, no indication that it has really done so.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the former Conservative Party leader and leading Brexiteer, Ian Duncan Smith. I asked him what he made of day one of the Brexit talks between David Davis and Michel Barnier.
I thought the mood music from the two of them, Barnier and David Davis, was very good. And also, Mr Barnier also made the same point. He said that we do not want to end up with a bad deal. It is not our purpose to do that. We want to see that this works well. And I thought that was quite a good, not concession, but certainly a good indication of the direction of travel of him as a negotiator.
You mentioned the word concession there. I mean, that is the reality, isn't it? After the election result, there's got to be a compromise, hasn't there? There's no mandate for a hard Brexit.
Well, Cathy, I just wish you or somebody else would define for me what a hard Brexit is or a soft Brexit. They're just ridiculous terms. It's like saying something, do you like something to be hard or do you like it to be nice and soft?
OK, well, I'll define the hard Brexit for you. Hard Brexit, then, is leaving the single market and the customs union.
OK, what's soft Brexit, then?
Not.
Not what?
Not leaving the single market or the customs union.
Well, then you haven't left the European Union. Even the Labour manifesto spells that out. Even Corbyn and MacDonald and Harriet Harman said, if you are leaving the EU, you cannot be a member of the single market.
OK, if you're not prepared to see a compromise on either the single market or the customs union, are you prepared, as the Chancellor clearly is, to see a compromise on a transitional deal so you take rather longer to separate yourself from the EU than was envisaged before? How long is too long?
I don't have any obligations at all to timescales. All I'm saying is that the idea of what we have to do is very clear. We have 2 years to work out what our arrangements are with the EU, and then we've left. Now, the key point is we may, in the course of those discussions, say that the EU and we want to spend another year or so or whatever, in which we may have some transitional payments or whatever. All of that is part of the implementation of the agreement. So
and you could stay in the single market or the customs union during that time?
No, the key point is we have left at the moment we finish with this. The question really is, what therefore does leaving as a process, how long does it take, what does it do, and what are the arrangements around it? What anybody over here wants or says they want, and what they get out of this in the course of the negotiation may be very different. The EU wants to have clarity. So if they want transition, they may want some transitional payments that take them through to their budget, so they don't actually have a hole that they have to fill at that same time. So the transition is more about the implementation of the final agreement, which is to leave, not be a member of the single market, not be a member of the currency union. The rest is just about how you go about doing that over a period of time, and I think that's the important point to make.
Well, I'm not seeing many concessions from you on this, but what about the divorce bill,
I'm not doing the negotiation.
But if you were, what would you say on the divorce bill? Would you sort of pay up, I don't know, 50 billion quid, for example, in the interest of moving on to the more important business of the trade talks?
Well, not really, because, of course, the point is, notice they use the phrase, make sufficient progress, because the EU knows something very important. And this is the fact that all of this is actually interlinked dramatically. So whatever arrangement we end up with the EU also has a financial implication, because if we're joining the WTO, well, we're actually a member, but if we become a full voting member, then that means that between us and the EU, we have to sort out what our financial obligations are, because as we separate from them, there are certain articles which have financial obligations in them, and we need probably to take some of those on. If we don't, it leaves the EU with a big bill. So we can't settle what the final element of who owes what until literally we arrive at the final conclusion about what our arrangements are.
Seeing David Davis confidently strutting his stuff today, did you think perhaps it might be better to have the strong and stable David Davis as Prime Minister, pushing this legislation through?
I wondered how long it would take for you to get round to that question.
Got there in the end.
Yeah, you did in the end, to be fair. Congratulations. The answer is no vacancy. And I'm convinced that we have to be stable and strong by staying together, not having leadership elections, getting on with this. We have this ticking clock. We have less than 2 years to sort this out.
And I'm joined now by the former Liberal Democrat leader and ex-Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, who lost his seat as an MP at the recent general election. Nick Clegg, there was a lot of goodwill today, wasn't there? But despite that, do you accept, as the Chancellor set out the weekend, that it is now inevitable that leaving the customs union and single market is going to happen?
I accept that that's what they keep saying. I think it's a very bad idea, and it's just factually incorrect to hear, as we heard once again from
you can't stop it, can you?
Well, I can't personally stop it. The British people can, and I think, oddly enough, they sent a message last week. It was a slightly odd way of doing it because they voted in large numbers for a Labour Party whose position is actually indistinguishable from Ian Duncan Smith and Theresa May. But certainly lots of voters, I think, were sending a message saying we don't like being taken for granted and being told there's only one way of doing Brexit. It is simply not true. Turkey is a member of the customs union, but not in the EU. I met the Norwegian ambassador, would you believe it, just by coincidence, about 45 minutes ago, and she said, why does everyone keep saying that you have to leave the single market if you want to leave the European Union? Norway participates in the single market, but is not a member of the European Union.
Well,
in other words, it is a choice.
It's
a choice, and that's very
important. But if you're a member of the single market, then you're bound by EU law, and Britain voted to leave. You're in denial, aren't you?
No, I don't think I'm in denial. I'll tell you what, I think that what the Brexiteers still don't accept either themselves or come clean about is that even if you do what they want, the very abrupt, rather harmful way of proceeding with Brexit, we will still be drawn into the legal and regulatory orbit of the European Union. We are, after all, a country floating off the northwest coast of the mainland of Europe. So we will be like a sort of satellite economy, a big one, but nonetheless a satellite economy, heavily dependent on trading with our European neighbours. We will always trade more with them than we will with countries on the other side of the planet. And that means we will willy-nilly end up abiding by their rules anyway. So why don't we open about the fact that we can't just simply sever all of those links from the European Union?
So that means some kind of transitional deal, does it, with staying in the customs union?
I certainly think a transitional. I mean, I've never understood this debate about a transitional deal. Of course you need a transitional deal. It shouldn't be an issue of debate. You can't just jump from one status to another. But as Ian Duncan-Smith quite rightly said, we will have all these arguments about money, people, transitional deals. Actually, it's the final design of Brexit, in my view, that still should be examined, because the choice, and it's a choice which has been foisted upon us. No one decided on the 23rd of June last year what the version of Brexit they wanted was precisely the same as Ian Duncan-Smith or Theresa May's. So they, in a sense, have usurped the normal democratic process and say, we will, on behalf of the whole country, decide how Brexit is proceeded.
But
I don't think that's very democratic.
OK, you can't influence that decision without pulling the levers of power in government, which didn't go too well for the Lib Dems before. But has the government been in
the pulling of the levers went exceptionally well. The subsequent votes in the
I'll come back to some of those levers in a minute, but has the government been in touch, as is rumoured, with the Lib Dems in case the DUP deal collapses?
I'm not an MP anymore. All I would say and observe about a hung parliament is it's pretty simple. If you have a hung parliament, in other words, no one has a majority, either you just stumble from one rather hapless, hopeless crisis to the next, which is what the Conservative Party seems determined to do, or you try and reach out to other parties. Now, they're trying to enter into this unholy pact with the DUP, which doesn't seem to be going very well. If there was proper leadership, particularly on the Labour front bench, they would recognise that instead of constantly game-playing on Brexit, the Labour Party would have to come clean about what their own views are and actually act with some responsibility towards our children and our grandchildren. Because this Parliament, even though it's slightly hobbled as a hung Parliament, will take decisions which will have a disproportionately large effect on the future.
Well, those talks between the government and the DUP have been slightly sort of put on hold, at least publicly, because of the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. Is it the case, as has been reported, that either David Cameron or George Osborne said, and you reported this, I don't understand why you keep going on about the need for more social housing. It just creates Labour voters. Was that said as a joke, or was it for real?
I think it was probably said flippantly, but certainly revealed an underlying truth, which is that over half a decade, amongst many, obviously, entirely inevitable differences between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives in coalition, we did encounter, as Liberal Democrats, an indifference verging on hostility amongst many Conservatives towards the need to replenish and build more social housing. It just wasn't in their political DNA, and I very much hope that one of the things that across all parties we will learn is that we need to invest far, far, far more over a sustainable period in social housing up and down the country.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much for joining us.